Hi, my Madeline neighbors. Hope you guys are all having a great day. We are going to start a new book about everyone's favorite neighbor, Mr. Rogers. And this is from the Who Was series, which I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. So we're going to start. Who was Mr. Rogers? Who was Mr. Rogers? One day when Fred Rogers was in high school, his teacher asked him for a favor. Another boy, Jim Staubaugh, had gotten seriously hurt during football practice. He'd been in the hospital for a while. He was well enough to keep up with his homework, though, if Fred could take him his books. Fred hesitated. He and Jim didn't know each other well. Jim was a popular athlete. He was the star of the football team, the basketball team, and the track team. He got straight A's. He succeeded at everything, and everyone liked him. Fred was not at all like Jim. He wasn't athletic or outgoing. Fred wanted to help out, though, so he agreed to visit Jim in the hospital. Fred was surprised at how well they got along. Jim was more than a good athlete. He was a good person. Jim and Fred became friends. When Jim went back to school, he spread the word. That Rogers kid is okay. Fred's friendship with Jim helped him become more confident and outgoing, and Fred was always grateful to him. Jim had shown Fred how one person could change someone's life. And there's the illustration. There they are walking down the halls in school. Years later, Fred did the same thing. He created and starred in his own children's television program, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Fred used the program to help kids understand that they were special just by being themselves. They were always welcome in Fred's world, just like Jim Staubaugh had made Fred welcome in his. So, Chapter 1, A Shy Boy. Fred Rogers was born on March 20th, 1928, into a wealthy family in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, not far from the city of Pittsburgh. His father, James, owned a factory that made bricks for furnaces. His mother, Nancy, took care of the family. They were loving and attentive parents, and they taught Fred to be kind to other people. Nancy volunteered at the local hospital and knitted sweaters for soldiers. Jim would leave pennies on people's windowsills. He liked to imagine their faces when he found them. Near the end of the Depression, when Fred was 11, his parents adopted a baby girl, Nancy Elaine. They called her Laney. Until Laney came along, though, Fred was an only child. Without a brother or sister, he was always looking for ways to have fun by himself. To make up for not having any real-life friends, he created pretend ones. He used paper bags or old socks to make puppets. He gave them different names and voices, and they all had their own personalities. As long as Fred had his puppets, he didn't get too lonely. He always had someone to talk to. He also taught through his music. He loved to play songs on the piano to express himself. I was always able to cry or laugh or say I was angry through the tips of my fingers on the piano, he said. He had begun playing piano when he was 5. A few years later, his grandmother offered to buy him a piano. She said he could pick out whatever one he wanted. Fred chose a grand piano. It was one of the fanciest, most expensive pianos in the store. His grandma had not expected to spend that much money, but she made Fred a promise, and she kept it. Fred sometimes had trouble fitting in with other kids. He was shy and chubby, and he got sick a lot. He had terrible allergies, and if there was a cold going around, Fred always seemed to catch it. Sometimes his mother wouldn't let him leave the house. Fred was stuck indoors while everyone else was playing outside. His family was wealthier than most people in Latrobe, and some kids were annoyed by that. The Rogers even hired a driver to take Fred to school each day. Sometimes Fred asked the driver to drop him off a block away so he could walk up to the building with everyone else. But he still knew he was different. Fred did have a good friend named George Allen. George was an African-American boy whose mother worked as a housekeeper for the Rogers family. After she died, Fred's mother invited George to live with their family. George was quite a bit older than Fred, and Fred looked up to him like a big brother. In those days, it wasn't common for white people to be friends with black people, but Fred didn't care. He saw George as his friend, no matter what other people thought. There's the two of them standing outside. George does look a bit older, huh? He's a lot taller. Chapter 2, Early Lessons. One day, when Fred was 8, his school let out early, and the family driver could not pick Fred up. He started to walk home by himself. Soon, Fred noticed a group of boys following him. They made him nervous, and he walked faster. They began calling out insults. "Hey, Fat Freddy," they yelled. "We're gonna get you." Frightened, Fred ran to the house of a neighbor. She let him come inside and play until the boys left. When Fred's parents found out what had happened, they told Fred not to worry about it. If he acted like he didn't care what the boys said, they'd leave him alone. The problem was, Fred did care. His feelings were hurt. He didn't understand why those boys were so mean. There was one person Fred knew he could always count on, though. Ding Dong. That was his grandfather. The nickname came from a nursery rhyme his grandfather sang to him. Ding Dong always knew how to make Fred feel good, and Fred loved spending time in his grandparents' farm on the weekends. At home, he often had to sit quietly inside. His mother's tidy home was not to be messed up. But at the farm, there was plenty of room to run around and explore. One thing Fred wanted to do was climb the stone walls that wound all over the farm. He knew his mother wouldn't let him, though. Those old walls were falling to pieces. He might hurt himself. Sure enough, when he asked her for permission one day, the answer was no. Then his grandfather spoke up. "Let the boy climb the stone walls," he said. "He has to learn to do things for himself." Fred was thrilled that his grandfather trusted him. He spent the next couple of hours climbing the walls. At the end of the day, Ding Dong told Fred, "Freddie, you made that day special just by being yourself." For a boy who did not have much self-confidence, it was an important thing to hear. Fred never forgot those words. There he is, climbing those walls. George Allen continued to be a big part of Fred's life and shared many of his interests with him. George taught Fred about photography, and Fred discovered that he liked to take pictures, especially ones with people in them. George also introduced Fred to jazz. Fred loved how the music sounded. It was full of surprises. Another of George's passions was flying. In the 1940s, George helped train a group of African American pilots who attended Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. The Tuskegee Airmen, as they became known, were an important part of the American forces during World War II. When Fred reached high school, George taught him to fly a small plane. George's enthusiasm rubbed off on Fred. Best teacher in the world is someone who loves what he or she does, not just loves it in front of you, Fred used to say. For a while, Fred wanted to be a pilot too. In high school, Fred felt like he was still chubby and weak, so he saved up $19 and sent away for a mail-order exercise program. Then he did all the workouts, but they didn't work. Fred realized he was never going to look like a bodybuilder. He was just going to have to be himself. Fred found things that he was good at and concentrated on them. He joined the French club and the photography club. He edited the yearbook and wrote for the school newspaper. He was elected president of the student council. He had finally found his place. Fred for president. Chapter 3, Leaving Home. Fred graduated from high school in 1946. By then he'd changed his mind about becoming a pilot. Instead, he decided to become a diplomat, someone who works with people from other countries to help solve problems. He enrolled at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. He planned to study foreign languages like French and Italian. They would help him talk to people from different parts of the world. After a year, though, Fred decided he didn't like Dartmouth very much. The winters were long and cold. He thought the teachers weren't very friendly. Plus, he missed making music. Fred transferred into a music department in Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida. He liked the people at Rollins College, and the warmer weather was nice too. One of the first people Fred met was another music student named Joanne Bird. She was amazed by how Fred could play the piano by ear, without using any sheet music. Sometimes he played popular songs everyone knew. Other times he could make one up on the spot. No one else could do that. The two became good friends. At Rollins, Fred was a good student. In 1951, he was set to graduate with a degree in music. Then he wanted to continue his education at a seminary, a place where he would study to become a minister. Fred had grown up going to church, and he wanted religion to be an important part of his life. But everything changed during this last year of college. When he came home for his school break, his parents had a surprise to show him. They'd bought a television. Television was still very new in the 1950s, and not many families owned one. Fred had never watched TV. He was curious to see it. Later, Fred could not remember the name of the first program he watched, but he did remember one thing. It was terrible. It showed people throwing pies in each other's faces. Fred thought that was just a silly waste of time. TV was coming into more and more living rooms every day. If programs were made well, television could be both entertaining and educational. It could be a wonderful way to reach people, especially young people. There's that pie in the face. So here's a little bit about the early days of television. One of the first television stations to begin broadcasting was a General Electric plant in New York State in 1928. But not too many people saw the news program that WRGB aired 3 days a week. Almost no one owned a television set yet. By 1951, there were about 10 million sets in the United States. Everything was still broadcast in black and white, and stations did not broadcast overnight. But audiences loved all the entertainment they could watch without having to leave their homes. Most shows were broadcast live, meaning audiences saw them at the same time they were being performed in the studio. By the mid-1960s, color television sets began outselling the black and white ones. So there's Fred. He's going to talk to his parents. After watching a single show, Fred made a big decision. He told his parents he wasn't going to seminary after all. Instead, he was going to look for a new job in the television business. They were surprised and not sure that Fred had thought things through. "You've never even seen it," they told him. "Well, I've seen enough of it here that I'd like to try," Fred replied. He knew he was doing the right thing. Okay, so tomorrow we will pick up with chapter 4. It's called In the Studio, which is where Fred is going to start his television career. Okay, I can't wait to learn a little bit more about our favorite neighbor, Mr. Rogers. Bye, guys. See you tomorrow.